Welcome to the Global Day of Learning. Thank you to Congregation Beth Israel for being our host and to Reconstructing Judaism for sponsoring this talk. I'm hoping that we can do this somewhat as dialogue, so we have the mic, and if you would like to say something, raise your hand and someone will get the mic to you. You can raise a question anywhere along the line that you would like. When I was in college, one of the posters that was up in an extraordinary number of my friends' dorm rooms was said the following: I do my thing and you do your thing. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you are not in this world to live up to mine. You are you and I am I, and if by chance we find each other, it's beautiful. That's where the poster stopped. The quote actually goes on one more line. If by chance we find each other, it's beautiful. If not, it can't be helped. So why was this poster so popular? Because it embodies an ethos that is broadly held in America then and now. We might call it individual expressionism or expressionistic individualism. The quote is by Frederick Salomon Pearls, better known as Fritz Perls. But what it gets at is a huge shift in the nature of culture from the way it existed in earlier times. When we lived in organic communities where neighbors knew each other well, it was a normal thing if you saw a neighbor's kid acting up for you to step in if the parent wasn't around. It was a normal thing if neighbors were quarreling to try to get involved in settling the quarrel. Today, that behavior would be viewed quite reprehensibly. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking with the rabbi about what to do about a parent who had disciplined another parent's child, and this has started a civil war between the two families. That's a different world. And the world we're inhabiting has had side effects that are really quite surprising. One of them is social disapprobation as a force in shaping adult lives has dropped to a bare minimum. One simple example of that is how little is said about the fact that we have a president whose allies acknowledge that he lies daily. Shockingly little is said about that. And that's certainly true in our lives as well. I mean, people hesitate to comment on the actions of others to them. When ethics are effective, the primary way they're held in place is by social agreement. And what we've seen in America, particularly over the last 50 years or so, is a gradual erosion of the capacity to see or acknowledge or certainly enforce that social agreement. And the result of that has been a social breakdown that is much more extensive than most of us have paid attention to, because the thing about erosion is by nature, it's gradual. When something occurs very gradually over a long period of time, we don't really notice it until we hit rock bottom. And we're not at rock bottom yet, but moving more quickly in that direction than I would have imagined possible as a young person. Jews have a particularly vested interest in this issue because at the core of what makes Judaism work is Jewish community. And Jewish community is only possible when there's a high degree of mutuality, mutual commitment, mutual concern, mutual binding together. And that binding together can't take place without our sharing similar life rhythms and similar ethics. So as this breakdown has increasingly affected the Jewish community, particularly the liberal Jewish community, we are seeing the side effects from it affect our lives in ways that are too numerous to mention. So what's the antidote to that? I would suggest that it can be found in a verse in Leviticus that says, Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. You will surely reprove your neighbor. Now, reprove actually sounds funny in your ears because that word has fallen into such disuse. Reproof means taking to someone to task for what they've done. And aside from employers criticizing employees for the work they do, there is a remarkable lack of reproof in our society. What I'd like to do with you today is do a close reading of a text about that, and then look at a couple of other sources that are connected. The text we're going to read is from the ethics section of the Book of Knowledge of the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah was written by Rambam, Moses Maimonides, who was a medieval scholar who lived in Egypt, an unusual man. He was both the Sultan's physician and a great philosopher, but in the Jewish community is perhaps best known for his work in halakha and Jewish law. The Mishnah Torah is his code of Jewish law, and this excerpt deals specifically with how you should understand that verse I quoted, Hochiach tochiach et amitecha. What is tochacha? How do we understand reproof, and how are we obliged to apply it? I've given you the Hebrew text, but I'm going to stick with the English for the sake of clarity and brevity. You should note that the translation is taken from the appendix of my book, Making a Difference, A Guide to Jewish Leadership and Not-for-Profit Management. There are a whole bunch of useful texts at the back of that. So, quoting the Rambam, when one person wrongs another, the injured party should not hate the offender and keep silent, as it is said about the wicked. Absalom did not speak good or ill to Amnon, for Absalom hated Amnon. So I was speaking on a slichot night in a distant congregation from this one, I hasten to say. And I was talking about tshuva and the need for attention to tochacha, and two women were arguing furiously at the back of the room as I finished. And I said to the rabbi of the congregation, "What's going on back there?" And he said, "Oh, those two women have been feuding for so long that even though I've been here 25 years, it started before I got here." So that piqued my curiosity, and I walked to the back of the room and asked them what it would take to settle their feud, since the essence of tshuva is mutual forgiveness. And they each told me that the other was totally at fault. And I asked them what it would take for them to find peace between each other. And they said almost in unison, "Over my dead body." That is the essence of what Rambam is talking about when he says the injured party should not hate the offender. When you're wronged, Rambam is saying, you need to go to the person and address them, because when someone has a moral fault, if you care about them, you will try and heal it. If someone has done something wrong, it's your job to mend it. And that's a real challenge, because clearly the opposite of not hating the offender is loving the offender. It's really hard when you're angry or upset or feeling undermined or put upon to find within yourself the capacity to say, this is my fellow human being. I have to reach deep inside of myself and find love for that person, because the only way people can hear criticism effectively is if we do it out of love. So to love the other here poses two challenges. First, to accept upon yourself the obligation of tochacha, of reproof. And secondly, the obligation to search inside yourself and find some love so that you can do it in a loving way. Not a small ask. And then the other sentence I read is about Absalom. Absalom, as you may remember, was the son of King David who rebelled against King David and organized the troops to take his side. And the accusation of Amnon here is he knew what was going on, but he hated Absalom enough that he didn't intervene in a time that could have saved the deaths of all those people involved in that rebellion. And the point of quoting that is not to condemn Absalom here, but to condemn Amnon. Because when we see something going wrong and we don't interfere, we share equally in the responsibility for it. Silence is consent. And to continue the text, it is one's duty, the word in Hebrew is mitzvah, to tell the commander, the offender, saying, why did you do this to me? Why did you wrong me in this manner? Now, I don't know how often you have tried to give a reproof, but it's very interesting that it starts with a question, not a statement. The question is, to the offender, from your perspective, what was going on here? If you want to do reproof, you have to find common ground first. And the common ground can only be discovered if you say to the offender, what was going on here for you? What's this really about? And the answer that you get will give you an idea of how you can do a reproof that the other person can hear. The person knows that you're upset, but has been drawn into the conversation by your initiating the conversation with a question. Why did you wrong me this way? Gives the offender a chance to explain his or her side, their side of the story. And you don't really have the capacity to do reproof till you see how the whole story fits together. If, as I once witnessed, someone knocks someone over in a ski lift line, it looks like that person's a terrible offender till you realize what they did was stop someone who looked like they were going to fall and really hurt themselves. So the context turned this from an act of disregard to an act of much higher regard. We need to know the context before we can offer reproof. And that's the beginning of fulfilling the mitzvah of hocheach tochiach et amitecha. If the offender repents and seeks forgiveness, the injured party must forgive the offender. That's the Rambam. I would interject that not all of Jewish tradition agrees with the Rambam here. One of my favorites on this subject is another medieval thinker, Bachya ibn Pekuda, who wrote the work Chovot HaLevavot, Duties of the Heart. And there he says, yes, the person has to apologize, but you don't have to forgive them until they do their best to make up for the damage. So they apologize, they make up for the damage to the best of their ability, and then they apologize again, and you're required to forgive them when they apologize the second time. So sometimes people are really glib in their apologies, and Bachya says that's not a real apology. We need to be attentive to what a real apology looks like and sounds like. There was a question there. I think there's a microphone coming to you.
It's applied to situations where you see somebody else doing wrong to somebody else, or is it just when somebody else does something wrong to you?
It applies in both cases, but here in this first part of this section of the Mishnah Torah, we're only dealing with the case where it is the one who was hurt who's doing the request. But yes, tochacha applies to a witness because if you witness and are silent, your silence gives consent to the act. So everybody has an obligation to do tochacha. And just as in life-saving situations, if you can save someone else without risking your own life, you're required to do that. We in America are used to a rights-based system, but Jewish tradition is mostly an obligations-based system. So whereas, for example, in America, we talk about a right to health care, in Jewish tradition, they talk about an obligation to provide health care, which is not an insignificant shift in terms of how we understand these things. So yes, here there is an obligation to do tochacha if you're aware of wrongdoing. So the forgiver should not be withholding. As it is said, Abraham prayed to God after Avimelech asked for forgiveness, and God healed Avimelech. Since I'm sure you were all in shul on Shabbos to hear this Torah portion read, you know the story, which is Avimelech took Sarah for sexual purposes, and the entire land that Avimelech ruled was punished before that act could be offered, and Sarah was then returned to Abraham, and Abraham immediately forgave Sarah. That's the citation here. I would just point out that Rambam is focused on the act rather than on the power dynamics, which are considerably more complicated in that story, but that goes further than we have time to go today. So now we move from the first part, focusing on when the sin is against you, to when the sin is against someone else. When one observes that a friend has sinned or is headed in a direction that is not good, one has an obligation to get that friend headed in a good direction and to make the friend aware of the self-inflicted harm in bad actions, as it is said, Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. I'm hoping by the time we leave here, everyone will have memorized that Hebrew. But the Hebrew actually is ish la'ish, person to person. So my translation here as a friend is gentler and more than the Hebrew is. When you see someone else who has sinned or headed in a direction that is not good, one has an obligation to do something about it. Now, the thing that's interesting about the word sinned is it can include two large categories of things. It can be you've seen that person do something against another person or another group of people, or even against a whole town. That's ben adam l'chaveiro, between one person and another or other people. And then there's the category of ben adam lamakom, between human beings and God. The word sinned here covers both of those categories. When one observes that a friend has sinned or headed in a direction that is not good, one has an obligation to get that person headed in a good direction and to make the person aware of the self-afflicted harm and bad actions. So note that they're saying, that Rambam is saying, when you do something bad to someone else, you should be aware that it's not only they who suffer. To do something bad to someone else is always also to do an act of self-harm, even though you may not be aware of it. Because bad behavior affects character. Bad behavior affects one's inner moral life. And just as behavior is an externalization of your inner moral life, so also what's outside affects what's inside. So one way of dealing with someone who may not be that open to tochacha, I can think of some politicians who I would put in that category. One needs to start sometimes by pointing out how the person's actions affect them, and then work outward to how it affects other people. And you have an obligation to do that, even though you may think the person's going to be really resistant. The fact that you don't think you're going to get anywhere does not, according to the Rambam and all the other sources actually, does not give you an excuse not to try. I think most of you are familiar with the story about the prophet who is yelling at people to repent, and no one listens to him, and the years go by and he goes on yelling, and the townsperson says, "Why haven't you given up by now?" He said, "Well, at the beginning I was yelling for their sake. Now I'm yelling for my sake." When we don't reprove, it not only doesn't have the desired effect on the person we should have reproved, it also has a negative impact on us, because not to reprove means, in essence, to accept that behavior. And when you've accepted behavior long enough, to your surprise, you can find yourself starting to emulate that behavior. So one who offers a rebuke, whether it is about wrongdoing involving the two of them or involving a sin against God, must offer the rebuke in private. Why in private? Because it's really hard to listen to anybody when you're feeling humiliated. If it's in a circumstance that is going to make you embarrassed and uncomfortable and uptight, you probably won't do a decent job listening to the reproof. So that's one explanation for this. Second explanation, you're not allowed to humiliate people in front of others, because that reduces their esteem in the community and it reduces the safety of the space. So what happens when we're in a group and one person disparages another is everybody else in the room feels less safe after that remark has been made. So a second reason why reproof should be in private is because we don't want people to feel all the time like they're about to get yelled at. A third reason is that what we want from the person we're rebuking is tshuva. Tshuva meaning a return to a better way of living. And they're more likely to do tshuva and stay in place if the community around them continues to respect them. So by doing this in private, we're avoiding a situation where we've exposed this person to community condemnation that can damage their reputation and be a reason why they feel freer to act badly in the future, because they don't have to worry about what anybody thinks of them. It's already too late for that. So you do the rebuke in private. The rebuker must speak gently and tenderly and emphasize that the rebuke is being offered for the good of the wrongdoer, to help the wrongdoer obtain access to the world to come. Of course, I'm not somebody who's going to emphasize access to the world to come. But I would say the only way you can effectively go into a rebuke situation is if you really believe that you have a way of talking that will show that this is for the rebukee's benefit. So if someone's acted badly in public, it may work to point out what the effect of what they did was on others and how that might make others feel about them, because no healthy person wants to be thought badly of. Notice I carefully inserted the word healthy there. So the rebuker has to speak gently and tenderly, making it clear to that person that they're concerned with their best interest. And for most of us, that means if we're going to offer a rebuke, we have to plan it. It takes an extraordinary amount of skill and self-possession to offer a rebuke on the spot. I once accidentally offended a colleague, and I saw him several times over the week, but it wasn't until a week later that he started to talk about it. And I said, "Why didn't you tell me right away? I had no idea I offended you. I would have certainly apologized on the spot." And he said, "I wasn't really able when it happened to talk about it in a way that I thought was an okay way to talk about it." And I thought that was really an admirable example of how to do tochacha. I strongly advise doing it when you're hot under the collar. So really good tochacha is usually planned, and it's done gently and tenderly. And the person has to know that I'm really concerned about them as I do it. If the wrongdoer accepts the criticism, that is well. And in my experience, if the tochacha is offered carefully enough, thoughtfully enough, gently enough, in a shockingly high percentage of the time, it's accepted. If it's done immediately, angrily, or badly, the percentage of exceptions approaches zero. So a lot of it has to do with how it's done. If the wrongdoer accepts the criticism, that as well. If not, reproof should be offered a second time and a third time. Sometimes it helps to bring in somebody else to do it the second time or the third time. And sometimes you may even need to take several people together, because the person needs to understand how concerned you are about what that issue is. I talked to a congregation president recently. They had a quite disturbed board member, emotionally disturbed, who had created chaos at several board meetings in a row. And when they decided that the person really needed to step off the board, they talked to several therapists in the congregation. They developed a strategy that was led by one of the therapists, and they sat down and had several meetings with that person before they eased that person off the board, because they wanted the person to really understand what had happened and what the consequences were of that happening, because clearly the words spoken along the way to indicate that that was a problem had not occurred. Seems to me that that was a really good example of tochacha, and the best way you can tell is at the end, the person who left the board was angry neither at the board, nor the president, nor even the rabbi, if you can imagine. And that's the consequence of planning rebuke, and when it doesn't go well at first, continuing to seek a way until it's heard. So when can you stop offering rebuke? One is required to offer rebuke until the wrongdoer strikes back at the rebuke and says, at the rebuker and says, I will not listen. In short, you do not need to get punched before you stop. If we all know that you can be in a conversation and see it heating up to the point of unproductivity, and that's really when you need to stop and wait. You could come back again, but if you really feel like the person won't listen, then you need to find someone else who can take on the next round. The next sentence strikes me as very much at the heart of what this is about. Whoever is capable of preventing wrongdoing and does not do so has responsibility for the iniquity by any wrongdoer who could have been prevented from doing so. You know, one of the meanings of the oft-quoted line, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Bazeh, each Jew is responsible for every other Jew. One of the meanings of that is when you're living in community and someone's doing wrong and the leaders and the followers in that community don't rein that person in, then everybody's responsible for the ill that follows. It's a shared community responsibility. And, you know, we can think of community as global, but here, Rambam is saying it's up to each individual to take that responsibility personally and not just say what's very easy to say, oh, I'm sure someone else will take care of that.
Question for you, David. You mentioned in your talk when people get hot under the collar and that's not the right time to approach them. I'm wondering about sort of the new science that says when we are so agitated, we actually are not thinking, we're not in our right mind, and whether that changes how we understand the person doing the behavior and how we understand the rebuke process.
Yeah, my understanding of the human mind is that it's actually three minds wrapped around each other. The inner mind, which is sometimes called the reptilian mind, has things in it like the fight or flight impulse. It's these really powerful instincts that can take over everything else. And it's the part that we usually don't use, but when it gets fired, it's more powerful than anything else in our minds. Wrapped around that is what some have called the mammalian mind, which is the seat of emotion. Anybody who's ever had a dog for a pet knows that animals feel emotion. And when emotion is powerful, it takes over unless it's superseded by the reptilian part of the mind. And the top part is the rational part of the mind, which you can think of as icing on the human cake. And it works really well, except when one of those other deeper layers is triggered. And we therefore should be mindful that when we are triggered on either that really deep level or on the emotional level, it is very unlikely we're going to think straight. That's one issue. Second issue is we bring our entire life experience to everything we do, both the parts we know we're bringing and the parts we don't know we're bringing. So I had someone in my office recently who was really angry at the chair people of his congregation. really furious. And what he said was, they just ignore me, they don't see me, they pay no attention to me. And immediately following that, I met with the leaders of the congregation who said, we don't know what to do about that person. We're trying so hard, and he doesn't seem to notice we're trying. So when I then went back to meeting with the person who was angry, we started in his childhood. He'd had a horrible, abused childhood in which everybody ignored him. And he carried that horrible burden around, and he thought as an adult, people were ignoring him when they just weren't. So it was pretty easy to bring peace among those folks because the people who were chairing the organization really did care about this person, and he really did want to restore the relationship. So all we had to do was to create a dialogue where that became clear. But the dialogue is essential to the process, and you'll notice I, as the middle person there, made sure I talked to both sides carefully before I brought them together. So sometimes when there's a lot of emotion, reconciliation can benefit from a third party. But yes, when you're feeling your emotions charging, it's a terrible time to have a tshuva conversation with anybody. Unless, of course, what you're feeling is overwhelming love, in which case, go for it. So one who rebukes another should not begin by speaking so harshly that the offender is put to shame. As it is said, do not thereby incur guilt. So to make sense of this, you should know that the rabbis made a great deal out of what colors people's faces turn. And they associated making someone's blood rush to their face, turning it red, as an act of violence, and the blood draining from someone's face, so they turned that awful gray white, as being an equivalent to having killed someone. So when they say, don't create shame, they're saying, you have to talk in a way that's sufficiently upsetting so that you don't get the person sufficiently not upsetting so that the person doesn't turn colors. If they turn colors, you're doing a bad job. And that's really a challenge in my experience, because there's some people it doesn't take much to create that level of embarrassment. And when you know you're dealing with someone like that, you have to figure out how to go far, far out of your way to be gentle and stress the positive side in them and the positive contributions they make to the community so that there's a context in which they are not shamed. You might assume that you should offer a rebuke until the offender's face changes color, and therefore it is said, do not thereby incur guilt. But here it can be inferred that it is forbidden to shame a Jew, especially in public. Even though shaming is not punished by whipping, it is still a major offense. Aren't you glad it's not? And again, a line that's in the text. So I, for the sake of honesty, I didn't cut it, but I was sorely tempted. That is why the sages said, one who shames someone in public will have no place in the world to come. This is a particularly good lesson for bosses and teachers, because it's really easy when you're standing in the front of a classroom to say something that is really humiliating to a student. And often you don't even mean that experience to be as humiliating as it turns out to have been. I was at a 25th college reunion. Needless to say, that was a long time ago. And someone who was there told me about having gotten yelled at when they walked into a lecture late, and it was done in a way that made the whole room turn around and stare at him. And it was 25 years later, and he was still deeply upset about that. There is, however, an exception to the no public humiliation rule, and that is if something is going on in the group, you may need to stop it there. And if something has occurred in the group that affects people in the group, sometimes the rest of the group needs to be aware of the nature of your tochacha, because wrongdoing in a group affects the life of the group. And sometimes there needs to be a repair in the group as a whole. What's the best way to do that? The best way to do it is to talk to that person privately and have them talk to the group about what they did wrong. But it doesn't always work out that way. But deciding to do it in front of a group is a risky enterprise, and I confess it's backfired on me before. So my best advice is try to find another way to do it if you can. And when you do it in a group, make sure that the benefit is going to exceed the cost. But one circumstance in which you have no choice is when what's going on is ongoing and you have to stop it. If someone is yelling at someone else in a group, you can't just let them go on yelling. Then you have to figure out a way to intervene right away, because that's ongoing harm and you have an obligation to stop ongoing harm. So there's a balance then between the shaming aspect and the harm aspect. And that's a subtle, difficult call to make, which is why it's particularly dangerous to do on the spot, because you haven't had time to really mull it carefully. Sometimes you don't have a choice. Just be cautious and make sure that you're not reacting, but you're reflecting and doing what you think best with the most rational part of your brain, rather than reacting emotionally. Because an emotional reaction is likely to make things worse, not better. A deep breath. Therefore, one must be careful not to shame anyone in public, neither child nor adult. And particularly where there are power dynamics such that the person with more power is the one acting, in that situation, it's particularly important to intervene. And I note that one of the things that happened in that classroom long ago was the professor who spoke ill was let to do that without any of the other people in the room saying a peep. And the consequence of that was everybody in the room felt quite horrible, not only for the person who had been coming in the door, but also their feelings about a professor who conducted himself that way, and in this case it was a him, obviously are going to affect how well they hear the rest of his teaching. So it's a struggle to figure out how to act, particularly when you're less empowered. I see two hands, so someone want to move a mic?
Well, I have the mic, so I'm going to go
Great.
first.
Go for it.
And then I'll give you the mic. My question is about healing for the person who, not the whole class, but the person in particular who the teacher yelled at and who is still carrying this 25 years later. And what healing is there for this person 25, 40 years later? Is the teacher still around? I mean,
You know,
it's not like they can.
what happened to that person is traumatic. And on some level, they're carrying around a certain amount of post-traumatic shock. There's a lot these days written about that. But for sure, one thing that helps is having other people say, that must have just been a horrible experience. I hear what you're saying, it's awful. I do a fair amount of work with Me Too issues. And really often what I see is the woman first was harassed or even worse, And then when she went to report it, she was not believed by whoever it was. And so the second trauma in some way is more important than the first. And the first thing I do when I hear her story usually is take it totally seriously and tell her she's believed. And that's acknowledging the feeling, acknowledging the hurt is part of the road to healing. But it's a long, hard road, and different people heal at different rates. So it's not easy to give a prescription or a timetable to that. But what I would say about it is, when you've run into someone with old hurt, the first thing you do is need to find a quiet space to say, tell me about it. And that's a really valuable service, even though the rest of the job may need to be done in therapy.
So also about that instance, what would the class who are observing this insult, what were they supposed to do? Like, what could they have done in that situation?
Well, one possibility would have been to write a letter and get class members to sign it, talking about why they thought that behavior was not acceptable, and to make sure that the person who had been subject to it knew about that letter. That would have provided some healing and solidarity to the person who had been hurt, and it would also let the professor know that wasn't acceptable to the class. That's a lot safer than one person standing up and taking on the professor, because you don't know what the professor will do to retaliate. So in a case like that, you look for group solidarity as a form of cover. Wait for a mic.
And in fact, that's more than cover, because you don't want to add more embarrassment by embarrassing the teacher who may not have, who may have been following bad instincts, but isn't a terrible person. So you don't want to embarrass them in public either. So I think your suggestion is terrific for that reason as well.
Okay, we're ready to go on? I think so. So I know that you're sad that no whipping is involved. But the notion remains that we need to find ways to do the communication so that the person truly understands consequences. And that can be somewhat painful. People should not be called by names of which they are ashamed, which, by the way, is one of the reasons we should be really careful with pronouns and with nicknames, and make sure that if it's a nickname, that that person likes being called by that nickname. But particularly here, when you're doing tochacha, you want to make sure that you're addressing them in a way that doesn't further add to their humiliation. It's one of the reasons why "hey you" is a really bad beginning to tochacha. Nor should anything that they find humiliating be told in front of them. So I first learned this rule when I was taking a marriage counseling course many decades ago, and the teacher of that course put it under slightly different terms, but ones that really stuck with me. He said, no garbage dumping. What's garbage? If you bring stuff from another situation and drag it into a conversation about this new thing that you need to talk about, that's garbage dumping. It's hard enough to deal with one avera, one transgression at a time. You don't want to be reminded of everything bad you've done since you were a little kid. Not only that, we don't have that long. The question of defining the tochacha narrowly enough so that it's really only about this one thing and nothing else is brought into that tochacha is really critical. And that is the same whether you're dealing with your 6-year-old your 46-year-old or your 86-year-old. I'm often struck by how much like kids we adults are. We suffer humiliation and shame just as easily. We struggle just as hard to try and figure out how we can stay on people's good sides. And for sure, if the tochacha involves garbage dumping, it's going to end badly, as well as be much less likely to be able to be followed up by a subsequent conversation. There was a person who was accused of harassment who really, truly did not understand that what he had done constituted harassment. It took us, I think, 6 conversations to get that person to all the way understand why what he had done was really wrong. And we would not have gotten past the first one if those conversations hadn't been open and exploring, and with him being constantly invited to talk about what was on his mind and what was his curiosity and his concern. So, you know, when we think of tochacha, we often think of somebody doing hit and run. And good tochacha is never hit and run. It's always about having the goal of reconciliation, and reconciliation is sometimes a very long, slow process. So we have to be prepared once we start it to hang in there for the whole process. The highest compliment that I think I've received in a long time was from that person who said, "When can we talk again?" Because that meant that we had held each other in relationship, which is the key to good tochacha. As long as you can hold each other in caring relationship, you can continue to make progress. And when that caring relationship breaks down, it's extremely hard to reconnect. So this applies to matters that are between people. Regarding matters involving heaven, if a person who has not been rebuked privately does not repent, that person should be rebuked in public, and the wrongdoing should be revealed publicly. This is a line from a world quite different from the world in which we live. Imagine a world where when someone cusses and they won't stop, the whole shtibel, the 40 or 50 families who worship in the shtibel, hear about it, are told about it, in order that everybody in the group should bring pressure on that person to stop cussing. Maybe in some world, we have a long, long way to go before that would happen in our world, because our communities are just not that tight-knit. And we can focus successfully on not cussing in front of the kids, because there's a genuine social benefit. But one of the things that we generally have chosen not to do is do tochacha when it's things between a person and God. So if somebody wants to come to talk to me about how to lay tefillin or what my personal prayer practice is, I am totally open to doing that. But I think even as a rabbi teaching Jewish traditions, I would occasionally maybe say, try this and see if you like it, but it never occurred to me to reprimand anybody for not doing it. And that's one of the differences between the world in which Rambam lived and the world in which we live. So the question that I would ask here is, does this wrongdoing that looks like it's between a person and God actually have a social outcome about which we can be concerned? Or does it have an outcome for the individual about which to be concerned? Long ago, when I was a congregational rabbi, a woman's father died, and she simply stopped coming to shul. Well, when that goes on for a couple of weeks, you don't think much about it. But when I noticed she wasn't in shul on Yom Kippur, I said, you know, even though that's a mitzvah between this person and God, maybe there's room for a conversation here. And so I made an appointment, we got together and we were talking, and she was furious with God for taking away her parent. And so we had a series of conversations that were partly about her hurt and partly about what theology she was invoking here. One of my favorite lines about theology was one I heard from Shmuel Atlas, who was a teacher who was from the Slobodka Yeshiva in Lithuania. Rather bullying teenager walked up to him and said, "Rabbi Atlas, I want you to know I don't believe in God." And Atlas, who was tiny, looked up at him and said, "Tell me, my dear, in which God is it you don't believe?" So, you know, the question was partly the pastoral question of her pain and her difficulty, but partly also there was some theological ground clearing that needed doing, because that was important for her personal reconciliation. So sometimes you can have that conversation, but that conversation is not about, why didn't you show up in shul on Yom Kippur? It's about, seems like things are really hard for you right now. What's going on for you? And again, you know, that leading question can lead you into some really powerful conversation. Persons who commit sins against God, Rambam says, should be reviled, affronted, and cursed until they return to doing good. This was the method used by all the prophets of ancient Israel. That's true, but have you ever noticed how few prophets ever got anywhere getting repentance? From this, you might deduce that this is not the most successful method of doing tochacha. In our communities, we want to be warm and we want to be welcoming and we want to be caring, but truly caring means also offering tochacha when it will be helpful. And in that form of tochacha, I suspect, is never helpful. So I want to take a quick look at the Talmudic passage that follows. Rabbi Hanina, Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Habiba said that whoever can prevent the people of their households from doing wrong and do not do so are punished for the wrongdoing. So far the same as the Rambam, though these guys were much earlier. If they can prevent the people of their town from doing wrong and they do not, they are punished for the wrongdoing of the people of their town. If they can prevent wrongdoing in the world at large and fail to do so, they are punished for that wrongdoing. Rabbi Papa said, the family members of the Reish Galuta, the head of the Jewish community in exile, are responsible for the whole world. So that means everybody's responsible, which, by the way, means that even though you're may be disinclined to vote sometimes, you have an obligation to vote, and you don't just have an obligation to vote. According to this, you have an obligation to be politically active against anyone who you think is doing evil in the world. I wouldn't dare mention names. And that you have an obligation to call out leaders when they're doing something wrong. But the further up you are in power and authority, the greater your obligation. So if you're the head of a department and there's sexual harassment going on in your department and you keep your mouth shut, you're directly responsible for that sexual harassment. If you're the head of an institution and you know some of the people are padding their expense accounts and you don't do anything, you're responsible for that theft. So the more power and the more authority, the greater the responsibility, not just for the institution, but for the moral life of the institution, for creating an atmosphere in which wrongdoing is unacceptable. And that, in a sense, is exactly the opposite of the Fritz Perls piece with which I began. The Fritz Perls piece say, you do what you do, I do what I do, and if we meet, it's beautiful, and if not, tough luck. Here, what we're told is we are responsible for each other. We are responsible for moral uplift for each other, and that means occasionally for chastisement. We're responsible for spreading goodwill and caring. And the final passage on the next page, Rabbi Tarfon said, I swear by the temple service that there is no one in this generation who is able to accept tochacha. Rabbi Akiva said, I swear by the temple service that there is no one in this generation who knows how to offer rebuke. Rabbi Yochanan said, I call upon heaven and earth to witness that more than 5 times Rabbi Akiva was rebuked through me in the presence of Rabban Gamliel at Yavna. Gamliel was the head of the court. Very humiliating to get rebuked in front of Gamliel. I complained about him, and Rabban Gamliel would then rebuke him. And I am certain that Akiva's love for me grew each time. That is, as it says in Proverbs, do not rebuke a scoffer who would hate you for it. Reprove a wise person who will love you for it. So that's the note on which I want to wrap up. If we want a community that is at its moral best, at its deepest caring for each other, we have to not only be willing to take the risk of offering a rebuke, but we have to, in good graces and open hearts, listen to a rebuke when it's offered to us. Because we want to live in a better world. And the only way we're going to live in a better world is if we each take responsibility for making it better.